In this nugget, we'll be addressing group policy. This is part 4, where we talk about delegation and security settings. We'll start off first of all by talking about some of the default group policy object permissions. Who can do what? Who can edit policies? Who can delete them? So on. Then we'll take a look at delegating group policy object permissions so that you might have additional administrators that you want to be able to somehow work with group policies, but maybe you don't want them to be full admins or full domain admins, for example. We take a look at the various security settings, which we've touched on a couple of times in the past, but we'll look at them in a little bit more detail here, specifically with things such as the password policy, account lockouts, things like this. And then we'll take a look at security templates, which are prepackaged settings that you can use to quickly and easily apply to a pretty broad scope of machines. All right, folks, I decided to jump on the bandwagon and put solar panels on my house. I'd like to tell you that it's because I'm environmentally sensitive, and that may be true to some degree, but even more than that, I want to save money on my electric bill. So in preparation for this, they sent an electrician out to my home to replace my entire electrical panel, and they have to do something like that to get it ready for the solar panels. So he came out, he disconnected power to the house. And then I found this quite funny. He walked over to an electrical outlet and plugged in his battery charger for his electric drill. I just shook my head and smirked and walked in the house without saying anything, where I proceeded to go to my office and flipped on the light switch. Yeah. Well, you know, power is one of those things we always expect. I mean, I'm sure that some of you, if you've had a thunderstorm roll through your neighborhood and some lightning strike or something has caused the power to go out, you probably, have still gone to the kitchen to flip on the light switch or turn on the television, right? You've done silly mistakes like I have, right? Huh? I'm not hearing any answers out there, so I guess I'm the only one. Anyway, we have a certain level of power with group policy objects as well, and basically that power is always turned on for a couple of different groups. So let's take a look first of all here at the default GPO permissions and how we can also grant additional permissions. First of all, who has full access to any group policy object? That's going to be limited to the domain admins, and of course that's because group policy objects exist in the domain, and domain admins have full control over that domain. And then there's the enterprise admins, and that's because the enterprise admin security group is nested inside of the administrator's security group in the domain. And so by that nesting, they also have full control over everything in the domain, as well as, of course, any other domains that are in the forest. And then there's the creator owner. This is kind of a different type of a group. Let's say that I create a group policy object. I might be the domain admin, and I already have full access, but I create that object. And once I created it, I have a special membership called creator owner. As long as I've created that on my own, well, I can also edit that with full control, and I can delete it, or I could, do anything else I want to with it. So anybody who's a creator owner has full access. Now, how's that different then than being a domain admin in the first place? What I could do is I could delegate control, for example, over an organizational unit, and I could say, hey, you people, the IT staff in that OU, you're able to create your own group policy objects, but not in the domain, not in other organizational units, nowhere else in the forest. Well, if they create a group policy object in their own OU where they've been delegated that permission, they are now the creator owner of it, and they would have the same level of access to it that a domain admin would, but only in that narrow scope. And then there's also the local system, which always has to have full access to a group policy object in order to make them available in the domain. And then I think we saw in the last nugget, or sometime recently here, that you have to have read and apply group policy in order to actually have it work, in order to have it apply to a user. And that would be the authenticated users. That would, of course, include my own account when I log on as the domain admin, because anybody that does log on is an authenticated user. All right, so that really applies to everyone unless you've made some exceptions like I showed you in our last nugget where we looked at security filtering. Now, if you want to grant some additional permissions, you can do that. One thing you could do is give someone the ability to just create a group policy object. If you want to do that, you'll simply add them to the group policy creator owner security group, or you can use the GPMC permissions. Let's go ahead and take a look at where we would do that. So here I am on my domain controller, and if I expand something out here, let's go to our groups and expand them out, then you can see them in the users container. And then what we have here is the group policy creator owners security group. This is a global group where if I just double click on it, click on members, notice that the administrator is already a member, but I can add in additional members. Okay, so this would basically give someone the ability to fully administer group policy objects, only since I'm doing it by group membership here in the domain, they would have that full access to group policy objects throughout the domain. This again might be too broad of a scope, and I might not want somebody to have that level of power. I might want to narrow them to only a specific organizational unit. But you know how this is done. You just click on Add, and you find the user, and you put them in there. You can also nest, of course, groups in that as well. The other thing we could do would be to use group policy permissions in the GPMC. So if I go to the GPMC here, oops, I guess I minimized it and I meant to bring it up. There we go. So maybe over to the Tucson users organizational unit, I could go to delegation and I could say I want to give somebody specific permission to link GPOs or perform group policy modeling analysis or results. Now, we talked about results in a previous nugget. Remember, that's where you can say, I'm not really quite sure what policies will apply to this user when they log on to their computer. Well, you can launch a wizard from this when I demonstrated that. Just so you know quickly what this is, it's very easy to use, but group policy modeling is very similar to that, except that you would say, you know what, I've got a user that's in the Phoenix office. What would happen if I dragged that user down into the Tucson users organizational unit and they received all of those group policy objects and they were no longer in the scope of management for the Phoenix users organizational units? Well, this gives us a good what-if scenario. You pick a user, you pick which computer they'll log on to, tells you what would happen. That's what the modeling is. Very useful in helping you to predict what would happen without actually doing it, because that could be potentially destructive or it might have unintended consequences. Now, of course, as you can see here, this does not mean that with these levels of permissions, that does not give me full control over everything. Notice there's no create GPO permission. Notice that there's no delete GPO kind of a permission. Nothing like that. So basically with this one, probably the higher level of control would be this link GPOs item, so that maybe I had a domain admin who'd already created a group policy in the group policy objects. Now, if I decide I want that from IOU, all I can do is to link it, but I would not be able to edit it or to delegate further control to other users, anything like that. However, if you do want a more granular level of control or more control, you can go over here to Advanced, and then you can just pick a user. I'll click on Add, and I'll put in my faithful Tucson user 01 account. And then now notice what we can do. We can give them full control, which basically would give them the same level of access that somebody like a domain admin or an enterprise admin would have over organizational units in the organizational unit of Tucson users, but only within that specific OU. So they could not only link GPOs, but they could also create, delete, otherwise modify these GPOs if I gave them full control. The rest of these are pretty well self-explanatory, but you can see they can read them, write them, create any child objects. This means that if there's a sub-OU underneath Tucson users, such as accountants in Tucson users or something like that, then they could work with those child objects for creating and deleting them, and also the resultant set of policy. This is very similar to the group policy results that we see down here. In fact, that's what that could actually be. I could run this with this level of permissions, but in addition, I could use a tool called RSOP, and that's a command line tool, and that also does resultant set of policy only from a command line. Now, on the other hand, as you looked at that dialog box there for the various permissions, remember that there was also a read-write item. If I only want someone to be able to edit policies, then in the GPMC I can grant them only those two permissions. This would not give them the ability to delete or unlink a group policy, for example, but they could make changes to it. If I wanted them to only link it, you saw that earlier, I could use delegation in the GPMC, or I could use that delegation of control wizard. I had to pause for just a moment there because I couldn't figure out my own acronym. I was trying to save too much space, I guess. Remember, the delegation of control wizard, which is where you right-click on an organizational unit and launch that same wizard. And then in similar fashion, if I want someone only to be able to, analyze the modeling or the results, then I can delegate that control either in the Group Policy Management Console, similar to what you've seen me do already, or again, the Delegation of Control Wizard also has an option for that. Now let's go here to one other group of specific security settings in GPO. This is one of the most foundational group of settings you need to know about, not only for practical reasons, but it's also important for the exam. Some of these things, such as the security options, which is second on the list there, has dozens of different settings. I don't expect you to memorize those, and I don't think you'll need to. However, I would go through those several times and just look through the list to familiarize yourself with the kind of things that are on there. And most of this stuff I'm just going to show you by way of demonstration, but the four main groups here, It's kind of like the four main food groups. Well, here we have the four main group policy object security groups of user rights. So, for example, would someone have the right to be able to shut down a computer? Security options, and there's, again, many of those. There's user account control, and you've seen that before, which, starting with Windows Vista, is where you have to be able to provide the correct credentials anytime you want to make a specific setting. For example, many of the security settings in Control Panel and so on. That's where it'll pop open with a username and password dialog box if you're not already logged on as an administrator. And if you are, then usually you get that yes/no option where you have to consent control there. Also, there's the audit policy, and that's somewhat important on certain workstations, but even more so on servers where you need to be able to track the kind of security events that are going on there because they have more sensitive data on those servers. Alright, so here I've quickly switched over to my domain controller, and I want us to take a look here at the group policy objects. Now also notice I cleaned up the group policy objects that we had there earlier, just for sake of teaching to make it less cluttered. In most production environments, you'll have dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of group policy objects to sort through there. But to make it clear here, we've kind of cleaned up a little bit. I've created this group policy object security settings, which we'll be looking at here in a little while. But before we get to that one, I wanted to just show you a couple of default ones here. Here one is the default domain controllers policy, for example. This is significant because it will have pre-configured settings that apply to all domain controllers. Only domain controllers will read this, and of course the reason being that in the domain controllers organizational unit, it's got that link. Okay. Also, the default domain policy appears at the top of the domain right here, and of course, as you might guess, it applies to all users and computers throughout the domain. Generally speaking, we try not to edit either one of these policies. We leave them be and allow their policy settings to flow through. The reason why we don't do that is because if you get, especially, kind of the too many cooks in the kitchen idea going on, and there's too many people editing that policy, you start to get a lot of confusion there. Usually you want these to be kind of baseline, maybe only a certain few authorized people to be able to edit them and make changes to them. For example, to password policies and things like that. If you do have other policies or other settings that you want to apply at the domain level, for example, though, you wouldn't double-click or try to edit directly on the default domain policy. You wouldn't do that. Instead, you'd create another policy here on its own, and then you would edit that one to apply to the rest of this. And of course, if there's more than one group policy object at the domain level, then you can adjust the order of inheritance on that level by going to link group policy objects. Notice there's arrows over here. I've only got the one. But if I have two or more up here, then I could click to move it to the top, move it to the bottom, move up one level, move down one level. Okay, and these are kind of going to be read in order of precedence from the bottom up to the top. Here, let me just put one up here to make it easy. Okay, it's kind of empty right now, but we'll just go ahead and do that. And then now you can see this. If I want this one to have the highest priority, then I'd click like this, and it would be at the top of the list. Now, anything that's in default domain policy that's in conflict with security settings here will be overridden. So security settings will take priority and precedence there. So anyway, having deleted that empty policy anyway, I want to go into Edit here to the default domain policy, because that's where normally our password policy is stored. And I'm going to show you the default settings that are there. This would be something that's good to know. You go into Computer Configuration, Policies, Windows Settings, and then Security Settings down here. As we go on to this, we'll take a look at Account Policies and then Password Policy, and you can see the default settings for this. Now, quickly, I'm going to go through these and identify what's going on with this. And I'm not going to do these in order because there's a logical order that makes better sense. First of all, how long does your password have to be? By default, it has to be 7 characters. Also, when you type in those 7 characters, how complex does it have to be? Well, if you take a look at this, you can see that it does have complexity requirements enabled by default. Then you can see here that it's got to have these requirements. I would definitely go through this, but the basic idea here is that it has to be at least 6 characters in length. Wait a minute, James, didn't you just say 7? Yeah, it says 7 characters right there. What this is saying is, if you don't specify here, but you do enforce this password policy, that even if this said 0 characters, this would still be override that, and it'd have to be at least 6 characters in order to enforce the complexity. Also, you'd have these characteristics, English upper and lowercase characters, based at 10 digits, which is 0 through 9, and non-alphabetic, which is a special character, such as these types of things. Okay, so those are the basic ideas there over the complexity. So 7 characters in this case by default, and then complexity has to be turned on, and then the maximum password age is 42 days. This means that as you approach 42 days, you're going to start seeing messages saying that you need to change your password soon. And then on the 42nd day, of course, you'll be forced to change your password, and you'll get that after you log on. So once you've changed the password, that should reset the clock, and you'll have another 42 days in order to keep that password. And then here we have the minimum password age of 1 day and the enforced password history of 24 passwords. These are kind of interrelated. Let's say that the person's password is going to expire today. And let's say that their password was fuzzy bunnies, and they really like that password of fuzzy bunnies. I should have picked something easier to say, but anyway. So they just say, okay, it's supposed to expire today, so I'm just going to change it to the same password. Well, they can't do that with these other 2 things. Why is that? Because it'll remember 42 passwords. This means that you cannot repeat the same password within 24 of the previous passwords. On the 25th password, they could go back to fuzzy bunnies, but in the first 24, they can't. Also, the other thing here is the minimum password age. If we set that to 0 days, for example, that would mean that if they were really persistent and they wanted fuzzy bunnies for their password, they could just change it right at the console 24 times in a row till they eventually got back to fuzzy bunnies on the 25th attempt. But this says that the minimum password age has to be at least a day. That means they can change that password. They have to live with it for at least a day before they can change it to something else. Okay, so they'd have to really be in love with that password and have to be willing to live with it for 24 days in a row, basically, before they could get back to that original one. And this kind of just frustrates that whole effort, and it prevents someone from keeping the same password continuously. Now, the other thing we have that's closely associated with this would be something called the account lockout policy. Let me explain what this is about. Let's say that on Friday I knew that my password was fuzzy bunnies. But then on Friday night and Saturday and Sunday, I went to the lake with some friends and had too many adult beverages and wound up killing too many brain cells, as if I could afford to lose any of them. And it turns out that on Monday morning I realized, hey, the brain cell that contained my password, it's been killed now. So I don't know what my password is. I think it's fuzzy puppies, or maybe it's bunny fuzzies or something. I can't remember. So I keep typing in the wrong one over and over again until eventually I might get locked out. Now, by default, notice that there is no lockout policy. Okay, so what this is telling us is someone could perform a brute force attack against this domain controller. Now, what's a brute force attack? That's where a hacker will typically use automated tools to go through something like a gigantic dictionary of common passwords. There might be tens of thousands of passwords in there. And eventually, they'll guess the right one, and they'll just brute force it, and they might attempt, I don't know, hundreds of attempts per minute, for example, to eventually get to the right password. And given enough time, you can generally guess, any password. It's just that when I say given enough time, that might mean years, depending on the complexity of the password. But if they're not well protected, it might only be a few minutes if they don't use complexity and long passwords and things like this. So if we wanted to further protect ourselves, what could we do about this? Now, the basis for this whole thing would be this middle setting, the account lockout threshold. This means how many times could someone enter in an incorrect password without being locked out? Okay, so we could say right now it's set at 0, so the account will not lock out. This would allow a brute force attack to occur. So let's just say that we could set this at 3 or 5. These are kind of common settings. So if I try to guess the wrong password 5 times in a row, well, now I'm going to get locked out. Notice that when I clicked OK, it automatically suggests these values, and these are OK. I'm just going to leave those at the defaults. Okay, and click OK and OK. Notice that these two have been set to 30 minutes now. So on the 5th invalid logon attempt, where I guess the wrong password, then it's going to lock out my account for 30 minutes. This will prevent things such as a brute force attack from being successful, because I'd have to wait 30 minutes before he could even start again, and even then, I'd only have 5 password attempts once again. So just in terms of the sheer amount of time that it would take to hack that, it really would be impractical from any hacking perspective. Now, if it's a legitimate user and they really just forgot, and now their account's locked out for 30 minutes, they would usually call the help desk and say, hey, went to the lake, killed some brain cells, and now I need you to reset my password. Well, the help desk will do that for them, and they'll be just fine. Similarly, what about this one? Reset account lockout counter after 30 minutes. This means, let's say that I entered in the incorrect password 4 times in a row, and by now, 5 minutes have gone by. I kept thinking, 5 minutes have gone by. So now what will happen is, in 30 minutes, it will reset the counter to the timer so that I could try it again. It's really very similar to this one. Not much difference really between the two of those in a practical sense. It's just that my account would not be locked out. I would just have to wait the 30 minutes. And at that point, it would reset my invalid logon attempts back to 0 here, not in the policy, but in the actual application of this policy. And then looking at some of the other things we had on the whiteboard there, let's go to local policies, and let's go to user rights assignment. Now again, I would recommend you don't have to memorize this, but I would look through the whole list and read through it 3 or 4 times maybe, so that you can get a good idea of the kinds of things that are on there. They all do have explanation tabs if you need to know a little bit more detail about them, but they pretty well explain themselves. For example, maybe I have a summer intern who's here from college, and he or she is learning more about computers, and so we want to give them some basic tasks. Well, we don't want to make them a domain admin and over-permission them. However, I do want them to be able to add new workstations to a domain, because maybe we got a new shipment of laptops, and they're configuring all of those, and they need to join them all to the domain. So I might add workstations to the domain, and then I would define the policy settings, and I would add Tucson user intern 01 or something like that. Okay, would add whoever that account would be. All of the rest of these have a similar function where you just add a user or a group. And again, just look through this a couple of times. Then we also had our security options, and this similarly, I would say also go through it a couple of times, 3 or 4 times, and just read through it and make sure that you not necessarily memorize it, but you know the kinds of settings that are available in here. Just as a quick example, let me just pick one out here. How about here? This is actually a pretty good one. Rename the administrator account. Hackers do know how to identify the administrator account, even if you rename it, but at least it will eliminate some of that lower-hanging fruit. And if you rename it to Joe Smith or something like that, it does not look like a security-sensitive account by doing that. The other thing you could do here, for example, I saw another one in here. Where was that? Oh, it's this top one. Administrator account status. You got to be careful of this one, but what you could do is to disable the administrator account on all the local machines. So let's say that we know that we never want the local administrator account to log on to any of those machines. This would help to prevent someone from being able to expose that administrator account, maybe if they were able to successfully guess the password or hack it, and then log on as a local administrator. Well, that could be a big problem. So on certain systems where I know that that will never be an issue, where the local administrator account will ever log on, then I will, where it says administrator account status, I will disable that, meaning that the account for the administrator is disabled on any machine that falls underneath this policy here. Okay, so that's just another example of something that you might use for this. Now then, for audit policy, what this does is it will create an event in the event log anytime I access objects of a certain type, or unless a certain event of some type takes place. For example, I could audit account logon events, so that anytime someone logs on, well, we can see that they logged on, and it'll appear in the event log. Or account management, so that anytime someone changes, for example, a password or a security group membership, then I will see that logged in the event log. So if I want to know, hey, who made that person a domain admin? Well, I could go into the event log and see that it was my summer intern, which I accidentally over-permissioned. So we could do that sort of thing. One of the more common things we'll use, though, is the object access. Okay, so if we double-click on this, we could define these policy settings for either success and or failure. Generally speaking, you want to do both success and failure, because if we want to see if someone's brute forcing a folder and trying to gain access to it, we would only do failure. However, we'll never know if they were successful if we don't always log success as well. You probably don't do this for every kind of a folder that you have, but for those that are more security sensitive, you certainly might want to do that. Now, that's only 1/2 of what you have to do if you want to audit object access. Also, you would not normally do this on the default domain policy, but in my small environment, it works out okay. What I would do then for the second part of this, besides enabling that auditing, is you also have to go to your file or folder object here. Let me just expand some things out. And let's say I've got some public files that I created here. Let me create a new text document. Okay, so a new text document, and I'll just call this, our birthday party. Okay, so maybe we've got a birthday party celebration going on. Let me just put in some text here. Get choco cake. Okay. All right, so let me go ahead and save that. And now I've got a document that I can work with. Now, let's say that I really want to make sure that no one changes that from chocolate to vanilla. Who would ever do such a thing? It's absurd. So I'm going to right-click on this. I'm going to go to Properties, and I'm going to go down to Security. And then once I get into this, I'll go to Advanced, and notice that now we have this Auditing tab, and I can click on Continue. Okay, I am an administrator, so I'll be able to do this, and I'll click on Continue. And then I'll click on Add, and I'll say, I want to know any time a specific principal, in this case, let's just say anyone or everyone, or even authenticated users. Okay, authenticated users. Anytime authenticated users, successful, failure, or all, anytime they try to read and execute, write, or modify, let's say modify because we want to see if they try to change it to vanilla. Okay, so we'll click OK and click OK. This would even track my own access to that specific file. But now, once that's been enabled, then I'm going to go ahead and just quickly refresh policy here as well. So let me do that also. GP updates, force. Then what happens is, now once we edit that file to modify it, it should appear in the security event log. So even now I'm an authenticated user just like everybody else, even though I'm also an enterprise and a domain admin. Let's just say that, I decided, I'm going to change that. No one wants chocolate. Let's change it to, how about butter rum cake even? Okay. Emphasis on the rum. Maybe that'll make it for a happier party. Anyway, we'll click on Exit and save this. Now, once I've done that, if I go into the event log here, let me just go back to this, and I'll go to open up the event log. Then, in the event viewer, where we view those event logs, we would go to the security event log, and we'll go to Windows Logs, Security. And then, sometimes it's a little bit of a bug hunt here. You have to really search for what you're interested in. But what we can see here, we got something going on here, something in the file system. Let's see. I think this is possibly the one that I just worked with. So let's go in to take a look at this. Okay, the trainer account. What did they do? We have an audit success. What did he successfully do? He or she successfully worked with Notepad and saved the file. If we go up and down throughout this, we'll be able to see specifically things. See out here, and sure enough, they worked with our birthday party. Again, it was a success. So we now know who's been fiddling around with that birthday party item, and we can now correctly admonish that user for selecting such a lame birthday cake. Now, one of the other things we talked about on the whiteboard is something that actually appears underneath the security options, and that was user account control. So let's go take a look at that specifically here. If we take a look at security options, and if you just look at it alphabetically, you can go down to user account control, and I would just, again, read through these just so that you're aware of what the various settings are. And among these is probably this one's the most critical. By default, it's going to, because of local settings on each current Windows machine, it's going to enable user account control. But notice if you don't want that, or if you want to change that default behavior from what's already baked into the operating system, you can use this policy. You got to use this with great caution, though. User account control is designed to improve security and to prevent casual users from making administrative changes. So you want to take a look at this very carefully. For example, this would say elevate without prompting. Wow. That would be possibly very dangerous. You can prompt for credentials on the secure desktop. That's where the desktop kind of dims, and then you have to click on yes to be able to allow that that administrative approval to pass on through, or if you're not logged on as an admin, to enter any username and a password of an administrator. And you can see some of these others here as well that are self-explanatory. That's for built-in. That's for administrators, but that's this one too. A behavior of the elevation prompt for standard users. In other words, someone who's not an administrator. What would happen there? Well, we could say automatically deny elevation requests. This means that nobody, even if you're really an administrator and you know the username and password, you still won't get a prompt. That might be useful for certain machines that we got to make sure that nobody ever touches. Maybe kiosk machines, something like that. And you can see some of the other default items here that appear as well. Anyway, for user account control, check those settings out, and those are also important to know about. All right, now let's take a look here at something called security templates. That's what we're going to be spending the remainder of our time here in this nugget talking about. Here we'll be looking at really what they are. These are basically just pre-configured settings for any of the security settings that you have. We'll be seeing this in the interface shortly here, but you can save those out to an INF file, or you can download them from a number of different sources. And it's pre-configured settings for example, a highly secure workstation, for a domain controller, for a file server. There's lots of different ones out there that you can choose from, and then you're not locked into whatever's in the INF. You can modify it for your own purposes. Also, you can use this INF file then to apply it to a single machine, as in a standalone or a workgroup membership, or to multiple machines, either by applying them individually to each one of those multiple machines, or by applying it to a Active Directory group policy object. And once you've applied it, of course, as you know, it then applies to its entire scope of management. That's what I mean when I say you can apply it locally or to a GPO. Now, the settings that apply in one of these INF security templates are the account policies, local policies, event log, restricted groups, system services, registry, and file system. Okay, so and you'll see this again in the UI, so I'm kind of going quickly past that. Plus, we've already addressed a lot of those in previous nuggets. And then in terms of how you configure it, you can do so in the GPO by right-clicking on the security settings and then importing an INF file that you've gotten set aside somewhere. You can use a command line tool called secedit.exe, and this is a very simple tool that you can use for scripting or something like that. It's not a real wildly complicated tool, so it's not too bad to use. You can also use something called security configuration and analysis. You'll see a console here of that shortly. And then I put it, that's a plus sign, plus the security templates console. Okay, so those are a couple that I usually work kind of hand in hand. You don't have to use them together, but they very often kind of work hand in glove, so to speak. And then there's the Security Compliance Manager, which is a tool that you can download. So basically, all four of those methods are what you can use to work with one of your security template INF files. All right, now having cleaned up the screen here, I've created a new MMC console by clicking on Start and Run and then typing in MMC. And then I added in the security configuration and analysis and security templates snap-ins by using add remove snap-in. Okay. Once those were in, I just want to point out what these are. First of all, this one will compare your local system that we're looking at here with security settings that are in a specific INF file. Now, where do the settings from the INF file come from? A number of different places if you want. You can download INF files from various places on the internet that have pre-configured security settings that are recommendations for specific types of security environments. Even the NSA, the National Security Administration, has templates that you can download if you want to use theirs even. So, as you can imagine, they're very, very restrictive templates. Anyway, what you would do is you would work with a database. You'd create a new database here, for example, and then you would compare the local computer against security settings in the INF. Now, the INF is really going to correspond to all of the settings that we looked at earlier. When we went to the group policy management under security settings, really corresponds to all of these different things. So rather than having to go through a machine, for example, and pick and choose every single little item here and configuring it, you could just use a prepackaged INF, and then you would be able to, first of all, see how well your local computer complies with it. Some of the settings or things that don't comply you could probably ignore in your situation. Just depends on what your requirements are. And then the other ones you might want to go ahead and apply. Now, if you wanted to create your own template here that you could then apply to other locations as well, then what you would do is to right-click and choose New Template. Okay, and then you would just call this a template name. Let's just call this, baseline security. Okay, for lack of a better idea. And then what you can see here, doesn't this look kind of familiar? Sure enough, yeah. It's the exact same interface for the security settings in the group policy object that we saw over here. Okay, now I can change all of these things, and I could put in, let's say, a couple dozen security settings. They have no effect at all. Okay, what we would have to do is we would save out all of those settings in an INF file, and then we would go back into a policy. Let's say that this was all blank and I hadn't configured anything yet. Then I would right click here and choose import policy and import the INF file. Okay, so that's kind of how that works right there. And then here I kind of jumped ahead and made some changes here. This is going to be how this is going to work. So let's say I made some things besides the default password policy settings you'd normally see on a domain controller. I've enforced the password history a little bit differently. Instead of 24, it's 5. Here I've made the password length longer, though. So those are a couple of changes. We didn't really describe this one, but we don't really use it very often. I'll just tell you briefly what it is. It used to be on older systems, older Windows systems and older Macintosh systems, that you'd have to store the passwords using reversible encryption for compatibility purposes. However, that really does not any longer need to apply. Macintosh, the Mac OS, doesn't really have any issues with this anymore, and this was very insecure. I'm surprised Microsoft still has it in here, by the way. What this does is it does store your password on the local hard drive, and if you know the right decryption mechanism, you can easily decrypt it. It's quite simple. A lot of hackers are able to make quick work of that. So we rarely, if ever, enable this. In fact, let's just go ahead and disable that, because we don't ever want to use reversible encryption. Okay, so now once I've got everything set up, and I might have done dozens of other settings down through here, then we've got my baseline security all configured. Then I can just go ahead and save this if I want. Okay, make sure I've got all my changes saved out. Then what I could do is I could go over here to my, for example, my default domain policy if I wanted to import them there, or like I said before, I don't usually like to edit the default domain policy, so let me clear some things up here so I get to the right location. And I will create another one. Let's just have this security settings item. Okay, so I'm going to right click on this one to choose edit. And then in order to import those changes that I just made to the security settings, I'll expand my way down through here to security settings. I'll right click to choose import policy. There's my baseline security, which I just edited. Okay, and now once we have imported that, it's really pretty simple. We'll see that if we go into our account policies and password policy, that we do indeed have the exact same settings. Why? Because that was all configured in the INF file when I saved it out. Now it's very easy to import it to any other location. Now, of course, you might wonder, why would I do this? Because normally you set this up once on a domain controller and it applies to everything anyway, right? So this really just kind of looks like more work. Well, in certain instances, you want to be able to do this. Number one, just kind of for safekeeping. Maybe these are settings I always want to make sure apply. If someone at a future point in time goes in and kind of messes around with the policies and goofs things up, I want to be able to forcibly reapply these settings. Maybe that would be one idea. The other thing would be, sometimes you might have local machines that are not part of the domain. Well, you can still apply all of these to a local machine as well. And then remember also, let me go ahead and close this up. Remember, this is called the security settings group policy. Remember, I would have to link that to the domain level. So let's go ahead and do that. And then once again, in order to make sure that it takes precedence over the default domain policy, which is weaker settings, I'd have to move this up to the top. Okay, so now this one will take precedence. But for the time being, let's go ahead and delete this just so that we can see again how to use the security configuration and analysis item. So I'm going to go back to my default domain policy, which has slightly weaker settings in certain places. And then let's see how this would work in the security configuration and analysis. What I would do here is I'd right click and choose open database, and I could create a new database by doing this. Or I could open an existing one that I have. And I've already got one that I've configured and opened up. At least I think I did. Maybe I didn't. Let's try that again. Let's just open a database. And I'll just call this one whatever, baseline security, again, something like that. And it's not an INF file, though. It's a database. Okay, so I'm going to open that up. And then I'm going to use this baseline security template in order to compare its security settings against. Now, once I've done that, I could go ahead and analyze the computer. And you can see right down here, it tells you how to do that. So I'm going to go up here, right-click, and I'm going to choose Analyze Computer Now. It's going to go create a log file for me here as well. And then once we go through this, we'll be able to see its current settings in comparison with what the requirements are in the template that we created. Obviously, the red X are things that need attention, meaning that there's a difference. The database on the INF specifies 5 passwords, but I currently have 24 passwords. 30 days compared to 42, 29 days compared to 1, and so on. So you can see all of these settings don't quite match up. Very, very useful for seeing whether or not your computer's up to snuff compared to the template. And then there's another way of applying that template as well. Once I've gone through this, I might see, hey, I'm not really matching up here, and I really wish I was. Then what I would do here is right-click and choose Configure Computer Now. Again, there's a log file that can be created, and now it has applied all of those settings. And then just skipping ahead here, you can see I've gone here to the default domain policy, and you can see that it has indeed imported all of those settings. In this nugget, we took a look at group policy. This was part 4, where we took a look at the ability to delegate group policy objects as well as the security settings. We started off, though, by talking about the default group policy object permissions. For example, remember, domain admins and enterprise admins always have full control over the group policy objects. But you can also delegate GPOs to other folks, such as help desk or somebody that you want to be able to link a policy but maybe not create their own. We took a look at security settings, such as things such as the group policy objects, password settings, account lockout settings. Remember, there's other things there as well, registry permissions and the like. We took a look also at security templates, which are a great way to pre-package various security settings that you want to be able to apply immediately without having to go through a policy and individually checkbox every single little item that you might want to apply. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.